Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. It's hard to believe we've been doing this podcast for over 5 years now. Our audience keeps growing, and we are excited to keep bringing you more insightful guests in 2022. But today, we're taking a look back. This episode features clips from some of our favorite episodes from 2021. The full episodes are, of course, still available on the ISF website, securityforum.org, and in our podcast feed. So if you missed one or you want to revisit the full conversation, you can find those episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. We are starting today with Dame Inga Beale, the former CEO and the first female CEO of Lloyd's of London. When ISF CEO Steve Durbin spoke with Dame Inga, they talked about a new style of leadership built on trust.
If you take a lot of leaders today, they're of a certain age, if I put it that way. And what you're suggesting is that these people open themselves up to a huge amount of what might be perceived as vulnerability because they have to share, and they're not used to doing that. What advice would you give them?
There is a definite move, I think, towards a different type of leader. And it's almost the power of the people saying, we don't trust you unless we know that you're not perfect, you're not invincible. Mm-hmm. So leaders need to understand that these days, actually, you are much more likely to get trust, loyalty, followers if you show some vulnerability. And as the CEO, it can be very difficult sometimes to admit you got something wrong. It can be very difficult to admit you're anxious about something. But if you come out and declare that, you usually see huge benefits. Mm-hmm. People like it. They want to see you as being really authentic and genuine. And to show that vulnerability can be a wonderful leadership trait these days. And I don't know, it probably has changed over the years. I don't think years ago I would have wanted my CEO to show that vulnerability. But now I enjoy showing my vulnerability, and the response, so that sort of feeling you get back from your employees is tremendous, and therefore a huge business benefit.
Last February, Steve spoke with actress, voice coach, leadership consultant, and expert in core energetics, or body-led psychotherapy, Kate Montague. In this warm conversation, Kate discussed the effectiveness in taking time to reset.
It's all about the planning, isn't it? There needs to be space, doesn't there? There needs to be the planning time. There needs to be just the decompression, the rethink, the reset, call it what you will.
All great words. Reset. We need to reset the nervous system. That's a birthright. We come on this earth in a container, our body. It's ourself. And of course, there's an emotional body, a physical body, and a mental body. Business is such that we can externalize only. We get busy with other people. We get lost in the back-to-back meetings. We lose our creative response. This will happen. We're human. And we can get triggered and we go into survival mode. So we're controlling, or we're gripping, or we're forcing, or we're blaming and, criticizing, and so on. So as you say, taking that space, it's similar to coming off the court in Wimbledon. You wouldn't expect the players to keep bashing it out. Those golden moments that they take to sit out, catch their breath, need to come back to a deep breath more deeply than normal, to feel the sensations of the body, to really have a check-in. What do I need? What am I missing? Where can I shore up?
Later that month, we also heard from Shoshana Zuboff, Harvard professor and author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Professor Zuboff spoke with Steve about the new economic order that claims human experience is now free raw material for commercial practices.
The real crime for society here is that we need the digital. We need the digital to solve real problems in the lives of real people. We need the digital to tackle our most pressing problems as societies, whether it's solving the many forms of cancer, or whether it's solving climate crisis, or whether it's putting into play all over the world hundreds of millions of brilliant and loving teachers and doctors who are the real solutions for most of our problems. But we are not using the digital to do any of this, Steve. We are using the digital. Most of the information that inhabits that domain comes from us without our permission, but it is not used for us. It is about us, but it is shunted into a narrow marketplace that is used to further others' aims.
Steve also spoke with Dr. Kate Stone, a creative scientist whose company, Novalia, blends art and science to create fusions of new and old technology. Dr. Stone told her own story about data privacy and reflected on how we can improve privacy in the digital age.
Based on your experience, how can an individual, let's bring it back down to that level, how can an individual really work through some of this quagmire of data, of information that's out there, some of which they perhaps would rather wasn't? What can they do about it?
It's really, really hard as an individual to undo all of that. I do agree there needs to be regulation. It's too hard to expect every individual to be able to do something about that information that's been gathered. I do think it has to be a combination of regulation, with actual consequences, but also just trying to better educate all of us in society that having that information and then having that information accessed can cause an undesirable chain of events to happen. And so, as well as regulation, can we actually start to think, do we really need to store that information? Do we really need to gather that information? Is it pertinent to what we're doing? Because, once it's seen, it can't be unseen. Collecting everything, storing everything, and making everything public isn't necessarily the right thing to do. We need to make that information a little more scarce.
In May, Steve interviewed Dr. Margaret Cunningham, principal research scientist at ForcePoint. Dr. Cunningham touched on leading a team that's working from home in the COVID era.
You just touched on burnout. Now, last year, again, I think it was in the summer, the Chartered Institute of Information Security came out with this statistic that some people might find shocking, that 54% of security professionals, they say, leave their roles due to overwork and burnout. Now, in an industry where we constantly talk about skill shortage, where we constantly talk about the need to try to attract more people in with the right skill sets and retain people and so on, that's pretty much a self-defeating number, isn't it? Because you're constantly trying to fill the bucket and it's got a hole in the bottom. What are the sorts of things that security leaders, great managers, can do to really address some of this overwork and burnout issue?
I think that to help people avoid burnout, we have to allow people to build expertise that is a little bit more focused and to let people stay on their tasks for a little bit longer. Whether that means you need more people, whether that means you need to figure out what the workflow is, it's up to you and how you run your company. But by asking people to, answer phone calls, deal with escalations, watch the security, manage people on top of that, we're definitely asking too much.
In June, Steve spoke with Harvard Business School professor Thomas Eisenman, whose latest book had just come out. Our U.S. audience can find his book under the title Why Startups Fail, while UK and Commonwealth readers will find the book titled The Fail-Safe Startup. Professor Eisenman shared case studies that illustrate why most startups fail and offered some insights into how startups can guard against those painful and expensive failures.
So your audience will be familiar with Dropbox for sure.
Right.
This is a great example. So the early adopters there were incredibly sophisticated software engineers who are working on multiple machines, collaborating with peers, and their needs for a file management service are different than the mainstream. And Drew Houston, the entrepreneur who built Dropbox, wanted to build a product that his mother could use to store her recipes.
Right.
And he had the discipline. He tested the product with the early adopters, they were howling for all of these incredibly sophisticated features, and he had the discipline to not put them into the product. He had done enough testing and had deep enough understanding to know that the product would be sufficiently superior for the early adopters to their alternatives, which sometimes are sort of plugging a thumb drive into your computer and forgetting to bring it home with you, sort of emailing files to yourself. And this business got going 10 years ago, so before the cloud was fully developed. And so in that case, he built for the mainstream and made a correct bet that it would be good enough for the early adopters, which it was.
Also, in the summer of last year, Steve talked to commentator and policy analyst Michelle Walker, author of The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore, and You Are What You Risk, the new art and science of navigating an uncertain world. Michelle addressed how to build a culture and a team that can balance your organization's risk appropriately.
A lot of boards or other executive teams will say, okay, we did our risk analysis and okay, that's it. And they were very, very frustrated that often the insights from the risk analysis didn't actually get put into action. Or
Right.
There would be people saying, hey, I'm here in my risk world that's kept in a silo, and I really need a way to talk to the other people in the company. And, with information security, it's that one person who clicks on the phishing email, and you really need every single person to be aware and responsive and to feel like they've got the power to do something about it. And that sense of agency is incredibly important.
Right.
And that communication is so important. And it's a problem very similar to what I faced in the policy world. And, you need the science to come up with the right policies, the right things to do, to really do a strong cost benefit analysis, to analyze, to understand the implications of what you're doing. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Then it's the communicating that. It's the hearts, not just the minds.
In August, Steve interviewed Executive Director of the AI Association, Josh Jackson, about the future of artificial intelligence and how the workforce can cope with the coming robot takeover.
How do we cope with the fact that artificial intelligence, machines, computers are not perfect? Neither are we as people. So how do we come together?
It wasn't long ago that we were confused about the internet, right? 20 years ago, everyone was going, well, what is this internet thing? What is online? What does it even mean? This seems scary, right? That you can buy anything online. And I think the same goes with moving into electronics within a vehicle. You mentioned electronics in a vehicle. At one point, there were no electronics in a vehicle, right? Everyone was afraid to get in a car because there's something different. And I think we need to move beyond that sort of, I see as almost like a pessimistic view rather than an opportunistic view, right? And even in business, we like to use the term sunk cost rather than here's a new situation, here's a new opportunity. This is going to give us a faster response time for cybersecurity, or this is going to give us more opportunities to combat a bacteria, right? Change the game in terms of antibiotic resistance, change the game in terms of how do we automate and get more food in the hands of individuals, change the opportunity for being able to communicate, right? We're communicating from across the pond, right?
That's right.
And I think the more we work on it and the more it continues to evolve, then we're going to have a faster response time even here. So that's kind of how I look at it. Is I think we need it individually. We need to change that narrative that's going on, and we'll be able to work through it once we see the possibilities.
In the fall, we released Steve's interviews with ISF 2021 Digital Congress guests. First among those was Dr. Brian Cox, a professor of particle physics at the University of Manchester. Dr. Cox is also the writer of several popular science books and has appeared in many programs for the BBC radio and television, including in Einstein's Shadow and the BBC Horizon series. Dr. Cox focused on the need for intellectual honesty.
Much of what security is all about today is, and increasingly will be, I think, is how we manage risk, how we measure it, how we try to make decisions based on perhaps our own or organisation's risk appetite. What do you think we can learn from science and scientific models that can help us in that process of risk management?
From my perspective, it's the theme of honesty, intellectual honesty. And I suppose I'm probably saying something that everyone who's listening to this podcast understands. But I think it is quite hard. In science, in my research area, particle physics, we deal with huge data sets. And so a huge number of statistics, as we say, lots and lots, billions of particle collisions. And so there's a framework to keep you honest, which is we have a very high level of what we would term to be a discovery or an observation. So it really is like flipping a coin 100 times, and it would have to come up 90 times heads before you claim that there's anything wrong with the coin. You know, it's not 51, but 90. You learn to get a sense for just having a hint of something interesting, or indeed a hint of something going right, is not enough. You've got to be absolutely convinced. And it's almost going above and beyond your instinct, I think. You know, I mean, I've made 10 Nobel Prize winning discoveries and all 10 proved to be statistical fluctuations ultimately, you know, and many scientists will have that experience.
Another ISF 2021 Digital Congress guest was Max McCune, a writer, consultant, and researcher specializing in innovation strategy, leadership, and culture. He and Steve talked about leading with long-term vision when you feel overwhelmed by day-to-day tasks.
What you're suggesting is perhaps introducing some sort of longevity to the thinking process. And a lot of people would legitimately, you could argue, come back to, I don't have that time. I've just got to respond. I've just got to get on to the next thing. How do we blend those two things together?
I think one thing that's really helpful is knowing that you are free to choose.
Right.
At this point, you are free to choose, as Sartre said. I can't tell you what to choose, but you are free to choose. And I think the more that people believe that that is the case, and the psychological evidence bears that out, when we feel strong, we feel capable of making a choice, and we are aware of more choices, we stop making the excuse that I can't, I'm too busy, because we know that's a choice too. And I totally feel for them. There are a lot of people in this world who are even busier than your security professionals, but many of them are juggling many, many things, impossible lists, impossible demands. But I think one, knowing that you are free to choose. Two, by dividing your timelines, your horizons into different pieces, we can say, how do I cope with today, but with grace? How do I not resent the interruption, because the interruption is inevitable?
And finally, in November, Apple co-founder turned philanthropist Steve Wozniak appeared as a guest at ISF 2021 Digital Congress. Woz reminisced about the past and reflected on his definition of success.
And a final question for you, Steve. What do you regret the most of not doing?
My formula for life is not accomplishment. It's happiness. How happy you are in your life. Maximize that. And the way you maximize it is a formula that I use: smiles minus frowns. Have a lot of fun in your life, even while you're working, and avoid the frowns. And if you look back and said, if we'd only done something different, well, that's a frown. You don't want that in your life. Arguing with people, don't argue with anyone, ever. You know, and you won't have frowns. That you don't really accomplish anything by arguing. Write good thoughts down, have your opinions, and don't be bad to others. Make everyone like you. So these were principles I used to have the happiness in my life. So I had it made. I didn't need anything like Apple to happen to make me successful in my life, in my terms.
We hope you've enjoyed this look back on some of our favorite episodes from 2021. Next week, Steve and I return to start a new season. In the meantime, is there a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode? Let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find that catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. Follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. And if you like the ISF podcast, we'd love it if you'd write a short review. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.